Gentlemen, welcome. Thank you very much for joining us. Perhaps you could just introduce yourselves for the record.
Well, I'm Professor of Economics, Applied Economics at Cardiff, and thank you for inviting me. I've written quite extensively on the European Union, and I have the first edition of a book in 2005 called Should We Leave the European Union? And I'm about to bring out the second edition next month. So
maybe roughly connected with why you're
maybe somewhat
we're drawing on your expertise.
It's the same. It's the second edition.
Okay, many thanks indeed. Perhaps I can ask Mark Hendrick to begin our question.
Okay, good afternoon, gentlemen. Could I start by asking you both how you feel how effective you feel that the EU is at leveraging its economic weight in pursuit of its foreign policy goals? So, Professor Minford?
I don't really study foreign policy, so I haven't really got much to say about this. You know, the issues of foreign policy in the UK-EU relationship, which is what Mr. Avery was talking about, are different, and there I think that, you know, the key thing for us is to remain friendly with our allies, and they'll still be allies. The economic interests and the political interests will still be the same. So I don't really see much implications of leaving for any of these foreign policy areas, and that's the bit I'd focus on, really. That you know, the key thing for us is our relationship with the EU and what sort of relationship we want. Having defined that relationship appropriately, I think we can then go on to rebuild the same alliances, the same common interest policies as we have now. As far as the broader, you know, policies of the EU in the foreign policy area, I haven't got any comment.
Well, could I just ask you both, and as a follow-up to that, clearly Britain as a country has got lots of aims in terms of trade, economic stability, helping in international development and climate change. Can I ask you both whether or not we feel, you feel, that Britain, as a part of the EU, adding to the weight of the EU, can be more effective in pursuing those goals, or whether a UK outside of the European Union would be equally as effective, and whether or not we can still do both remaining inside the European Union, so we would get the benefit of both worlds. Slightly leading question, but I'd like to hear the response from Mr. Minford.
I realise this is the Foreign Policy Committee, and therefore you're very interested in foreign policy, but I have to say the main national interest of the UK is to have a thriving economy and to control its own affairs. And the reason this whole issue of EU Brexit and so forth has arisen is because it isn't just a question of combining and sitting at the same table and having foreign policy influence that is at stake here. It's how far we control our own affairs when being a member of the EU that's committed to becoming a much more powerful state in its own right and has got qualified majority voting, which controls a lot of our own decisions. As Mr. Delors said in 1988, you know, to the Trade Union Congress, it won't be long before 80% of British laws are decided in Brussels. And of course that is what's thrust this right into the centre of the stage as an issue. And really, beside that, the question of whether we have more or less influence on joint policy, foreign policy making with the EU is fairly small potatoes. I think that really the question here is, from the point of view of our national interest, if we're outside the EU for other reasons, we'll still be there as allies and having common interests with all these other players. And no doubt we'll coordinate with them just as we do today. So the seat at the table won't be there, but there'll be other tables at which we will be sitting.
Are you saying we will have the benefits of the club without being members of the club?
I don't think the benefits of the club. I think foreign policy has always been conducted by self-governing nations to maintain and pursue their own interests. I mean, I come from a foreign policy household myself. I was always trained that foreign policy was about pursuing the national interest for your own citizens as best you could. And obviously, the question then is, do you want to be governed by somebody else, or do you want to be a common ally in some alliance with them. And of course the answer to that question is what lies at the heart of, to answer that question we have to answer the question, do we want to be part of the EU or not?
Where we have shared common interests.
But of course we have shared common interests, but that's not what the whole issue is about. When it comes to foreign policy, we'll always have shared common interests with all our allies, not just EU, the US, and many other players on the international scene.
Do you want to come in behind?
I hear what you say, but we've previously taken evidence that on trade deals, for example, having the ability to collectively negotiate, being a much more powerful economic unit, delivers a better deal than, say, a deal that Iceland can cut with China or a smaller country will be able to cut. Is that not then affecting our economic well-being?
Well, rather like foreign policy, this is another completely irrelevant issue.
Well, it's not irrelevant because
let me explain why it's irrelevant. Because you asked me what
sure.
the point.
But can you stick to economic well-being?
Yeah, I'm exactly going to talk about why what you just said is totally irrelevant. You see, the fact is, if we are an independent, self-governing nation, we'll join countries like Japan or Singapore or the US in the World Trading Community. And we will be a small nation of slightly over 30 million workers in a world market of 7 billion people. And one of the things that comes out of applied trade is that when you're in that position, trade agreements are totally irrelevant to you, because you are part of a global market, and you're a very small player in the global market. This is known, and you may not have come across it before, as the importance of being unimportant. And if you're unimportant, if you're very small, you can't influence the price of the goods you trade at. You're part of a huge market of 7 billion people, right? And we're only 30 plus million. Therefore, we will, as part of the world trading environment, we won't have any influence on the prices of the goods we sell. Our job is to be competitive and to produce good goods and good services. And actually, on the whole, we do. We have quite a lot of, thanks to the liberalization of our economy over, since the 80s, we have now got a very competitive economy made up of a lot of, we're now a nation of entrepreneurs and shopkeepers.
Professor, I get that. I've sold across the world.
And that's why, but this is why...
let me just come back...
No, but I want to just make the point that you don't seem to have understood, which is that these trade agreements are totally irrelevant. They won't make any difference to anything. We don't need any trade agreements. What we need is to get out of a protectionist trade arrangement, namely the EU customs union, right. And everyone says how wonderful it is to be inside the EU, but they for them forget that it's actually a highly protectionist organization, not just in agriculture, but also in manufacturing, and it's infinitely preferable to be in the global market under conditions of free trade. And that will give us huge gains. So the trade issue, far from being a great negative in terms of leaving the EU, is a huge positive. And what happens is that people think it's totally negative because we can't negotiate these trade agreements. But they've totally misunderstood the irrelevance of these trade agreements to our situation in the global market.
I get your point. So why is it that countries sign bilateral trade agreements?
Well, often large countries sign bilateral trade agreements. Like the EU is currently negotiating a huge trade agreement with the US. And, the fact that people sign trade agreements when they're very large is the case because they are large and they have monopoly power. But if you are small, you don't have monopoly power. You have no incentive to sign a trade agreement. Now, I'm not saying that there won't then be trade agreements, but if we leave the EU, some people say we'll have to rush around and sign a lot of trade agreements. I don't agree. We may sign the odd trade agreement if there's a particularly significant... I think we'll sign an agreement with the EU, mainly because the EU needs to sign an agreement with us, because it sells us so much stuff at inflated prices. And the great irony is that you only join a customs union. It can only possibly be in your interest if you sell people a lot of stuff within the union, much more than you buy from them. But we're in the opposite situation. So the EU will have a strong incentive to negotiate a trade agreement with us. And that will probably be the main trade agreement that we'll negotiate after we leave. It will be an agreement to give them sub-access to our market.
So we do need to sign trade agreements.
They need us to sign a trade agreement.
Yep.
I have costed us leaving the EU on the basis that we sign no agreements. Now, I think as a matter of practical life, there will be some trade agreements that will be signed because people will...
For what reason?
Because of vested interest, Mr. Zahawi.
Right, so
the reason for trade agreements are due to individual vested interests. They're not due to the national interest. I was talking about the national
Who's
interest.
vested interest?
Well, if you look at the EU, there are lots of people queuing up to say we shouldn't leave the EU because they have a vested interest in EU protectionism.
Whose vested interest is it to sign trade agreements for the United Kingdom outside of the EU? That's my question. Can you answer that question for me?
Yes, I'm trying to answer, but you don't seem to understand the answer. The point, Mr. Zahawi, is this, that the vested interest for us staying in the EU, inside the biggest trade agreement we've signed in the last 40 years...
With respect, that's not what I asked you. You said that you signed trade agreements outside the EU. We've now moved outside the EU, right? We're outside.
I see.
And you said that we sign trade agreements because of vested interest if we're standalone. In whose vested interest do we sign those trade agreements is my question to you. Please answer that question. I may be stupid, but just help me with that one.
You didn't listen to my answer. I said when we leave the EU...
He's persuadable. Professor, I think he's persuadable.
Let me try to answer it again.
I've said to you we're now outside.
When we leave the EU, we're in the world now where we've left the EU, there will be a lot of very upset vested interests who are gaining from being in the EU.
Like who?
The car industry, for example.
Yeah.
Yes.
How much do they invest in the UK?
Some parts of the city, any industry that currently gets protection from the customs union, okay, will be a vested interest, will be very upset when we leave.
Right.
And what I'm saying to you is that therefore we are very likely to have to be in the process of negotiation because those vested interests will be saying we want transition agreements, and the EU itself, which sells us stuff in those industries in a big way, will also want an agreement. And so, quite unlike what many people say, which is that we're going to be so badly off outside the EU, we have to sign in the national interest trade agreements, what I say is the very opposite. We'd be better off if we didn't sign any trade agreements, but lots of people will be pressing us to sign agreements, both the vested interests that are losing and also the EU itself.
Right, so just to be clear, the vested interest, for example, if we are outside of the EU, would be like the automotive sector in my constituency, in the Midlands, where we is now producing a car every 20 seconds, would be harmed in some way and therefore will want us to sign trade agreements. That's correct, right?
Yes, when you abandon protectionist agreements, the people who are protected don't like it. They get damaged. And it is, I think in practical terms, it's inevitable that we will sign various agreements to give transitional protection to various industries. I think a lot won't change immediately
because they matter
after.
to the UK, and they matter because they matter to the UK and the UK economic well-being.
Well, they are. Whenever one changes policy environments, some people lose, and we have a tradition in this country of trying to compensate losers so as to get consensus. And I think that tradition will prevail in this case. I think we will try to negotiate transitional arrangements that, help these people to move to a more dynamic future.
Like the automotive sector?
Including the automotive sector, parts of the automotive sector. Some parts don't need it, by the way. I mean,
before asking Dr. Wilcock to comment on the exchange we've had, help me here, because I understood the usual purpose of trade agreements would be to reduce the barriers you might face between the two independent small entities within a trading system who have a mutual interest in trading, that you would enter into agreements in order to try and reduce the barriers between the two entities, rather than manage protection within them. And so that the usual purpose of trade agreements is then trying to open trade from where us as a market of 30 million labourers or whatever would then be seeking to protect ourselves from competition outside, because the vested interests inside the United Kingdom would be working to to protect our internal markets?
Well, from the point of view of we're talking two small nations, right? Would they sign a trade agreement?
Yes.
From the point of view of each of their national interests, they should abandon each, from their own internal point of view, their tariff, because it's self-harming. Because the reason for those tariffs is some internal vested interest that has asked for protection.
But I understand that.
So if sometimes you do get a situation where two countries, small countries, come together and find that they can kind of trade one vested interest off again and therefore improve their own situation.
That's about as far as my economics goes. I could just about get that. But in terms of the kind of politics of and the facts of trade agreements, is that what you're actually trying to do is it's impossible to get to that perfect situation and then just abandon the barriers completely, and that trade agreements are a route to reducing those barriers progressively, because they begin to address the politics of protectionism within countries, and so that they're a route, in the sense they're a route to begin to sweep the barriers away. I would buy the free trade argument. I think that it's that no barriers are best of all, but they exist.
Yes, I mean the point here is that if the UK was to leave the EU and go to free trade, just abandon the EU's tariff and just simply unilaterally free trade, which would be its best policy, barring vested interests which wouldn't necessarily like that, then there'd be no point in it engaging in any trade agreements with anybody, because it would already have reduced all its own self-harm from its own tariff barriers. A tariff, if you're a small nation, a tariff barrier has the effect of self-harming you. You create inefficiencies in your own economy. You don't affect anybody else. You raise the prices at which other people sell to you, to your consumers, by putting a tariff between them and the world market.
Okay.
But when you abandon the tariff, you lower the price to your consumers and make your consumers and your economy better off. And if we'd already gone to free trade, there'd be no point in any further trade agreements. And so in that sense, they're irrelevant. But of course, you're quite right. In the real world, we probably wouldn't go to complete free trade, and therefore anything we could do to persuade our own vested interests to abandon certain sorts of protection would be good.
Can I ask Dr. Woolcock to comment on the discussion we just had, and then come to Mr. Rosnell, and then back to Mr. Sawi?
Just very. So what
Can we have Dr. Woolcock let him join us, and then we'll meet you? Okay.
Dr. Woolcock answered it was about non-tariff.
Andrew,
just as one very quick point. We'd all like to see a day where we don't need to have free trade agreements, when we have a proper free market globally, but that's not happening now. And surely the main point of this is, by not being in the EU, the United Kingdom could have whatever trade deals it chose to have with other countries around the world to harness the Commonwealth, the English-speaking world, the global market, which is the future markets of our country. But being in the EU restricts us from that freedom to do just that. And with the trade deficit we have with the EU, the only losers would be if the EU tried not to trade with us or put barriers up to trade, would surely be the EU itself. So we have, I don't know if Professor Minford agrees with me, but we have the ace card, we have the upper hand in this.
Yes, let me come back to this, because this is the key point. You see that by leaving the EU, we abandon a customs union. Now, my old mentor, Harry Johnson, actually fought against the 1975 referendum campaign. He tried to explain to the British people that it wasn't a great idea to join a customs union because it was highly protectionist. But he got nowhere. He got nowhere. He didn't get his point across. But it's come back now, 40-odd years later, and it's central to this whole thing, because what people are saying is that if we leave the EU, it's disastrous because of all the we'll lose leverage, blah, blah, blah. But the truth is, we'll move, if we've got any sense, to a liberalised economy fundamentally under free trade. I mean, it isn't in our interest not to have free trade for the sorts of reasons that Mr. Rosendale has pointed out, that, it pays us to be a global player under free trade. It pays us to to sell our goods to other people in the world market and to take their goods at world prices. That will lower our cost of living. We have actually done a simulation of leaving the EU, and the first thing that comes out is an 8% drop in the cost of living on day one, because of the move from EU prices to world prices. Now that is really worth having, and it means that we then are in a world in which we don't actually, we can of course sign lots of extra trade agreements. We will definitely be forced by the EU, for the reason you've given, that they sell so much to us, to have some sort of agreement with them. I mean, the last thing they will want us to do is to walk away without some sort of free trade agreement, so-called, with the EU, because they are so dependent on our market relative to our dependence on theirs. I mean, they are selling us stuff at inflated prices on a massive scale, compared with what we sell to them on inflated prices within the customs union. And so, there will be definitely that trade agreement with them, because they will push for it, as you rightly said. And otherwise, as I've kind of argued already, we don't need to do trade agreements with anybody else. I mean, frankly, we can take the world price. And if we do a trade agreement with, say, I don't know, New Zealand or something, it won't affect the world price we get. It'll affect what New Zealanders have to pay for our goods. Because, we sell the stuff at the world price, and then the New Zealanders, if they put a tariff on it, their consumers have to pay more. So it's really a problem for them, not for us. And so I'm sure we will do trade agreements. There's nothing, I'm not doctrinally against trade agreements. I'm merely saying that they're not necessary for our well-being in terms of leaving the EU. They would be a nice add-on for people like the New Zealanders, whom, if we could do something with them, would help their own consumers.
Right. Yasmin Qureshi.
Well, thank you for that. Can I just ask a question, though, which is the current situation? We are in the European Union, so we are where we are. And at this point, with what we've got, to what extent does the European Union's current priorities for international trade reflect the UK's national interest? And therefore, does it act as a multiplier for our economic influence in the world, or is it effectively putting a constraint on us, the current situation, so the current European Union, and maybe perhaps
Yes, I mean, well, we looked at, this is a calculation we've done.
Professor, let's...
But I'll let my colleague, Dr. Woodcock,
just for viewers,
speak.
Professor. Yeah.
So, I love this fact that, we have this great influence on the EU and make it a much better place. It may be true. It may make it more liberal. But your question originally asked, what was the cost for the UK in this arrangement? And that's the thing that worries me. I've already answered Mr. Rosendale about the fact that the customs union itself is extremely expensive to us. The regulations that are increasingly put on us in labour markets and financial markets are very onerous to us, and of course cost us serious resources. And they also hold back growth. Many of these regulations are not in line with free market principles. And so when you add all these things up, it may well be that we have a force for liberalism inside a fundamentally illiberal EU political and economic philosophy. But the costs to us are very large. And the question is, in our national interest, it may be great for us to contribute to the wider world interest by making the EU a more liberal place and encouraging trade agreements and so on and so forth, but at huge cost to ourselves in being in this particular club, where the club itself wants to have more and more control over what we do, and it's control that doesn't seem to be in our interests.
Mark Hendrick.
Can I ask you both, what in your view would be the optimal framework for the UK's relationship with the EU if it chooses to withdraw its membership? And in that, I'm looking in particular at the so-called Swiss or Norwegian models that people have talked about. So I was waiting for Mr. Minford to
Could I have a quick go at this one?
Same
Very quick,
question.
because I've already
Professor
answered it
Paul,
in
yes.
terms of your question, actually,
Well,
Mr. Blunt.
that's
You
fine.
know, I'll answer it again because, you know, Dr. Wilcox is a great expert on trade agreements, and that's wonderful, you know, but as I've said earlier, they are totally irrelevant to the UK in this respect, because what he's talking about is trade agreements between large blocks, large monopoly suppliers. And my answer to you, Mr. Hendrick, if you want to hear the answer, maybe you don't want to hear it.
I think you've forgotten the question. No,
You asked me what we should do if we left the EU, but you don't want to hear the answer.
I asked you to look at the Swiss model and the Norwegian model.
I was going to
Now, they're
answer
small
that question.
countries trading
I was
with
going to
the EU.
say, we don't want either model. I did answer this to Mr. Rosendale. The model we want is the model of a standard self-governing country. I don't know why it is that everyone seems to assume we've got to become a small dependency of the EU, even when we leave the EU.
Well, we've got that, but what we're trying to say as well, in order for the Norwegians and the Swiss to trade with the EU, they have to comply with the acquis, well, certainly in Norway's case, the acquis communautaire, many other rules and regulations, which I, as a former MEP, have sat down and worked on directives and rules that actually you have to comply with in order to trade. Now, are you saying that the EU is suddenly going to drop all these requirements to comply with certain standards on food quality, on air standards, on certain rules and how services operate, just because Britain chooses to leave the EU and wishes to behave differently than other nations like Norway or Switzerland?
Well, about 9% of our GDP is exported to the EU, about 9%. So on that 9%, yes, we would obviously comply with all the standards, because every exporter has to comply with all the standards of the country it exports to. So yes, but that's 9% of our GDP. If you ask me, do we have to have all the regulations of the EU in order to sell that 9% of our GDP to the EU? I'd say no, because the other 91% of GDP will be free of those regulations, and it will operate according to the regulations we, as a self-governing country, think are good for our industries. And there's absolutely no reason for them to be the same as the EU. None at all. Obviously, if the EU insists on certain things it wants in those exports, standards, whatever they might be, obviously if you export to the EU, you'll have to do it. By the way, our trade with the EU is contracting as a share of our total trade, whereas our trade with everywhere else is expanding. But yes, it's 9% of our GDP. So if you're telling me that the other 91% of the economy has got to comply with everything in the EU in order for that little 9% to export, I say to you, where's that come from?
Thank you.
Finally, can I bounce my own thesis off both of you? Is that for the United Kingdom, our unique selling points, as it were, are things like legal services, financial services, education services, culture and media, pharmaceuticals, perhaps, and these are all things with a global market rather than a regional one. Is it possible, if we're outside the European Union, for us then to pursue a much more aggressive and specialised agenda around those industries and services, in terms of trying to get market entry to other markets, or I suspect Professor Minford's point would be we don't even need to. But Professor, let me.
Since Dr. Wilcox has kind of told us a lot about why we need to have all these trade agreements, I think economically they're pretty small potatoes, really. You know, I think that the main thing is to have products, as you rightly said, that people want. Pharmaceuticals. You've had a good list of industries where we're very competitive, and people are falling over themselves to buy our products. And that's what you want in a global market. You need to be a highly competitive economy, producing a lot of interesting products, so your 30-odd million people get good prices in world markets because they've got good products. And so the key thing for me is that we should be part of that global market, able to compete with it and in it because the prices, because we're buying inputs from the global market and not from a protected EU market, which is excessively expensive. By joining the global market, getting out of the customs union, we make ourselves much more competitive. We then indeed are focusing we're then in line with our comparative advantage, which is to produce the things you just sort of listed, which are high-tech, skill labor-intensive products. This is where our comparative advantage lies. At the moment in the EU, what's happening, and this is the big cost to us from all this trade protectionism that comes with the EU baggage, the big cost to us is that we're forced, a lot of our industries are protected inside the EU, and so our comparative advantage is distorted into industries that really we're not very good at. That's the key thing. So I say, for a global market, we can focus on these industries where we are good and make sure that they are highly competitive. And then, you know, as I said earlier, we really don't need trade agreements. I'm not particularly against them. I'm perfectly happy for other people to have trade agreements, and there may be minor things that... but of course, in the case of the US, it is our oldest trading partner. We have massive trade with the US in these products you're talking about already. And the EU has much less trade with the EU than with the US than we do. If you include the whole service area, we're already deeply integrated into the US market. And so for us, you know, TTIP is kind of like, I think, a minor kind of extra element in the story.
How does the how does the United Kingdom get past the vested interest of the Indian insurance industry, woefully inefficient, let's presume, I don't know whether it is or isn't, but let's say it's far less efficient than our own. However, they can buy Indian politicians in order to deliver the regulations in order to protect them.
Well, this is a really good example of what I've been trying to say all evening.
Yeah.
Actually, it's a matter of massive indifference to us whether the Indians inflict harm on themselves by refusing to buy our insurance services or not, because our insurance industry is world competitive. It's not infinitely large. It has a definite size. It is limited in size because it's in a nation of 30-odd million workers. So if the Indian economy decides not to allow British insurance, there's plenty of other people who will be ready to buy British insurance, and it's a global market. I mean, the insurance industry in the City of London is the world's biggest market, and it deals with every part of the world, so that it's not dependent on any one country to sign a trade agreement with us. And this illustrates perfectly my point that the insurance industry is going to survive fine, whether or not India wants to liberalize. Obviously, we'd all prefer if India liberalized. It's good for India. But it's actually, from our point of view, the big issues here are, do we want to be part of a global market with free trade, or do we want to be inside the EU, inside a customs union with highly restrictive policies and extremely tough and, excessively interventionist regulative policies? That's the issue for us, and that's the big issue that really completely dominates all this detail of trade agreements once we leave this organisation.
John Barron.
May I just return us, if you like, to the World Trade Organisation and the concern expressed by those who worry about leaving the EU that there would be punitive tariffs imposed, or could be punitive tariffs imposed on the UK by the EU. When we know it's not in their interest to do so, we run a large trade deficit to the EU, I accept that point, and I doubt whether they would be allowed to do so. Article 50 makes for some sort of provision, etc., Article 50 of the Lisbon Treaty, that is, for some sort of arrangement post-exit. But there is a concern out there that perhaps, not a widespread concern, but a concern all the same, that the EU could retaliate in some form with massive punitive tariffs. I mean, could I take your view on that? My understanding, and I may be wrong, is that the WTO says that most favoured nation, status nation, means that you actually keep the tariffs as they are at the level of other countries. And so, with the States, for example, it's, no doubt you'll correct me, but it's more like...
That would be my understanding, but Dr. Wilcott's a great expert on this.
But I would be interested in your view as to, in the worst case scenario, what could the EU do to it?
Well, I've costed the whole business of leaving the EU on the assumption we have no agreements with anybody. And the EU just applies to us the MFN tariff, any non-tariff barriers it wants. And what, of course, then happens is we leave, we become a normal country outside the EU, which is something that many countries are, and we then face world prices. And that is immensely better than being inside the EU's wonderful tariff wall, because that protects too many bad industries. Compared with what we would have if we were out there in the global market selling the things we're good at, our comparative advantage, which is enormously liberating for us and would stop us thinking of ourselves as a regional player, which we are not, but give us the mindset of a global player, facing world markets. And we're a small global player, so all we've got to do is produce things that are good, we can sell for high prices to anybody around the world. And as I said, the world is a very big marketplace, so if somebody wants to put extra tariffs on us, that again makes no difference to my calculations. Now, as you rightly said, and I believe the EU will want to sign an agreement with us, because it's in its interest, because they sell us so much stuff at inflated prices, net. And so they will want, I mean, the boot will be entirely on the other foot to what most people say. Instead of us going cap in hand to the EU saying, please sign an agreement with us, they will come cap in hand to us saying, please sign an agreement with us because we want to sell to you.
Professor, on that note, we've not wanting to keep you here as long as Hillary Clinton was kept by the Congressional Committee. Can I say thank you to both of you